There is a question that outlives every generation. It whispers through temples, laboratories, and lonely bedrooms at 3 in the morning. It has no single answer. And yet, it shapes how we see everything. That question is simple. Is the soul real? For thousands of years, humanity has searched for a word to describe the invisible force that moves us, the something behind thought, emotion, and dream. We've called it spirit, essence, consciousness, psyche, and soul. Philosophers wrote about it as early as Plato. Scientists now try to measure it through brainwaves and fMRI scans. And still, it escapes definition, like a wind that can be felt but never caught. Carl Jung once wrote, "The soul is not a concept. It is a living thing, and it is not under our control." That line alone sets the tone for everything that follows. Because for Jung, the soul wasn't a poetic metaphor or a religious ornament. It was the deepest layer of human reality. It was what dreamed through us, what suffered in silence, and what longed to be known. He said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls." And perhaps that is still true. We live in an age that can split atoms and edit genes. But we have not yet learned how to listen to the quiet voice inside that asks, "Who am I, really?" Modern neuroscience would answer differently. It would say that who we are is the brain, an organ of patterns and impulses, billions of neurons firing in exquisite harmony. And yet, when scientists map the brain, they find activity but not meaning. They can see the circuits that produce emotion, but not the reason you cried when you saw your child born. They can measure consciousness, but not why consciousness feels like you. This is the boundary where psychology meets mystery, the point where data turns to silence. Jung stood at that boundary long before brain scans existed. He didn't see the soul as an object, but as a relationship, a living dialogue between the ego and something infinitely older, infinitely wiser. The soul, he said, is the patient teacher of the ego, leading it from the small world to the great. That teaching often begins when life falls apart in crisis, in loss, or in the quiet ache that success cannot soothe. In those moments, something stirs behind the surface of our identity. It's as if a part of us that has been forgotten starts to speak again. You might call it intuition. Jung called it the self, the totality of who you are, not just the visible mask you wear. And he believed that the soul is the voice of that self, calling you toward wholeness. But what does it mean for something to be real if it cannot be weighed or photographed? Is the soul an ancient superstition, dressed in psychological language? Or is it the missing piece in our understanding of what consciousness truly is? Jung never claimed to have proof. He claimed experience. The psyche, he said, is reality itself. We know nothing beyond it. To him, the inner world was not a shadow of the outer world, it was the world, seen from within. And so we begin with this paradox. Science tells us that consciousness emerges from the brain, while Jung suggests that the brain may be an instrument through which a deeper consciousness expresses itself. One approach measures, the other listens. One seeks evidence, the other seeks meaning. Between them lies a question that refuses to die, not because it cannot be answered, but because perhaps it must be lived. So before we choose a side, we must understand both voices. The next part of our journey will explore the modern scientific view, how neuroscience defines the soul, or rather, why it denies it. Only then can we return to Jung and see what happens when psychology dares to cross the boundary of biology. To understand what Jung was challenging, we must first look at what the modern world believes. Science begins not with faith, but with observation, with what can be seen, touched, measured. And when it looks at human beings, it finds no trace of a soul. What it finds is a brain. 3 pounds of extraordinary tissue, pulsing with electricity, sculpted by millions of years of evolution. To a neuroscientist, this organ is not a vessel of mystery. It is the mystery itself. For over a century, laboratories have been trying to locate the source of consciousness. And the deeper we look, the more precise our measurements become. We know which regions light up when you dream, when you fall in love, when you pray. We can watch memory form like a path being carved through a forest of neurons. We can even predict decisions a few seconds before you consciously make them. To many scientists, this is enough to say that the soul is an outdated metaphor, that What ancient mystics called spirit is simply chemistry, perception, and pattern. The Nobel Prize-winning physicist Francis Crick once declared that you, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and ambitions, your sense of identity and free will, are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their molecules. This is the materialist creed, that everything real must have a physical cause. And yet, the more we learn, the more the question returns, who is it, exactly, that is watching the neurons fire? When a patient wakes from anesthesia and says, "I was gone," what vanished? And who is the one speaking those words now? Neuroscience can measure activity, but not awareness. It can describe the map, but not the traveler. And this, Jung would say, is where science begins to touch the limits of its own method. He once wrote, "Science is a tool. It is not the path to the whole truth. It describes what things do, but not what they mean." Meaning, for Jung, was not an illusion. It was the most fundamental human experience, the axis around which sanity itself revolves. A patient who loses meaning, he said, does not just suffer mentally. Something in the soul becomes disoriented. The lack of meaning, he observed, is the suffering that pervades modern humanity more than anything else. So when modern neuroscience claims that the mind is nothing but matter, Jung would nod and then quietly ask, then why does matter dream? It's a question that has haunted scientists since the dawn of consciousness research. Because even the most advanced technology cannot explain why an arrangement of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen should produce the taste of memory, the color of grief, or the ache of love. In purely physical terms, there is no necessity for experience. And yet, experience is the only thing we truly know. Carl Jung once remarked, "We have no knowledge of what the world is beyond our perception of it. All that we know is the psyche, for it is through the psyche that the world exists for us." In other words, we don't stand outside the mind observing the universe. The universe is always filtered through the mind itself. The scientist looking into the microscope is using the very thing he's trying to dissect. Still, we must honor what science has achieved. Its insights into the brain have healed diseases, explained behavior, and revealed how profoundly connected body and mind really are. When neurons misfire, moods change. When chemicals balance, despair lifts. The physical world and the psychological world are not enemies, they are mirrors. Jung himself, though steeped in myth and symbol, never rejected biology. He said, "Spirit and matter are two different aspects of the same thing." He only warned that when we reduce everything to matter, we amputate half of reality, the inner half. The neuroscientist peers into the brain and sees a storm of light. Jung peers into the dream and sees the same storm reflected in symbols. The scientist says, "Consciousness arises from neurons." Jung says, "Neurons arise within consciousness." Both are describing the same landscape, from different directions. So when we hear that the soul is only the brain, we should not rush to dismiss it, nor to defend it. We should ask, instead, what it means to be human in a universe where matter can awaken, can love, can wonder. For perhaps the soul is not a separate thing hidden inside the body. Perhaps it is what the body becomes when life looks inward at itself. This, Jung would say, is the turning point, where science meets psyche, and measurement begins to tremble before mystery. And to understand what that mystery reveals, we now step into Jung's world, into a psychology that dares to describe not just how we think, but who dreams us. When Carl Jung first began to speak of the soul as something real, he was not making a religious claim. He was describing a fact of experience. For him, the psyche was not a byproduct of the brain, but the very medium through which life becomes aware of itself. He once wrote, "The psyche is the greatest of all cosmic wonders, and the sine qua non of the world as an object." In other words, without the psyche, there would be no world at all, only matter without a witness. Jung's journey toward this realization began within science itself. As a young psychiatrist at the Berg-Holzli Clinic, he studied patients diagnosed with schizophrenia. What astonished him was that many of their visions mirrored ancient mythological images they had never encountered. Dragons, suns, serpents, cosmic mothers. These were not random hallucinations. They were patterned, symbolic, alive. He began to suspect that the human mind carried, within its depths, the entire history of consciousness. The dream, he said, is the small hidden door in the deepest and most intimate sanctum of the soul. Freud, Jung's mentor, would have called those images repressed desires. But Jung saw something more, a vast inner architecture organizing itself beyond personal memory. He called this the collective unconscious, a field of archetypes, primordial forms that shape how every human being dreams, loves, fears, and creates. In that realm, time and culture dissolve. What was true for an Egyptian mystic or a Greek tragedian reappears in the symbols of a modern patient. The psyche, he realized, was not merely individual. It was cosmic in scale. From this insight arose his understanding of the soul, not as a theological object, but as a dynamic bridge. He distinguished between the ego, the conscious I that organizes daily life, and the self, the totality that contains both the known and the unknown. The soul, or what he sometimes called the anima or animus, mediates between them. It is the interpreter of dreams, the artist of imagination, the quiet guide leading the ego back toward wholeness. The soul, Jung said, is that which mediates between spirit and body, connecting the above and the below. Jung often used myth to describe what reason could not capture. He said that the psyche behaves like nature. It grows, evolves, and demands balance. When the ego tries to dominate, the unconscious compensates through symptoms, fantasies, or crises. He compared this to the myth of Icarus. Fly too close to the sun, and the wings of pride will melt. We do not become enlightened, he warned, by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. To him, the soul was not a state of eternal purity, but a process, a continual dialogue between light and shadow. He called this lifelong process individuation, the realization of one's inner totality. It is not about perfection, but integration, embracing the opposites that live within us. The shadow, the inner feminine or masculine, the wounded child, the wise elder, all must meet and speak. The privilege of a lifetime, Jung wrote, is to become who you truly are. And that becoming happens only when the soul is allowed to speak. But this raises a profound question. If the psyche contains both consciousness and the unknown depths that shape it, then perhaps the soul is not created by us, but acts through us. Jung once remarked that we are the dream of the psyche. The mind that believes it is the author of its thoughts may in fact be a character within a much larger narrative. This reverses everything we assume about the self. The ego is not the king. It is the servant. The soul is the hidden author. Modern people, Jung said, suffer from a loss of soul. We have gained the world of facts, but lost the world of meaning. He wrote, "Man cannot stand a meaningless life. If he cannot find meaning, he will invent it." That invention, he warned, often takes the form of ideology, addiction, or blind belief. The task of the soul is to restore meaning by reconnecting the conscious mind to the ancient language of the unconscious, the language of image, story, and symbol. And yet, Jung was not a mystic detached from reality. He believed that the symbols of the soul must be lived, not merely admired. Dreams, he said, are the psyche's letters to the ego. To ignore them is to live only half a life. When a patient told him, "It's only a dream," Jung would reply, "And what else are you?" So, is the soul real? In Jung's framework, reality begins within the psyche. What we call soul is not a ghost hiding behind the brain, but the inner landscape through which all perception passes. To say I have no soul, in Jungian terms, is to say I have lost contact with myself. The return to soul is therefore the return to reality as lived from within. In this way, Jung does not contradict science. He completes it. Neuroscience describes how we think. Jung describes who it is that is thinking. The laboratory measures the currents of the brain. Jung listens for the current beneath, thought the living current that has been dreaming humanity since the beginning of time. And that brings us to the next step of our exploration. If the soul is a living process, if consciousness itself carries an ancient pattern, then the evidence for it should appear not only in symbols and myths, but also in the anomalies that puzzle even scientists. Dreams that predict, visions that heal, memories that outlive the body. To see where science and psychology converge, we must now look at those strange frontiers where experience exceeds explanation. Even in an age of satellites and quantum computers, the line between science and mystery has not disappeared. It has simply moved deeper inside us. For all our advances, we still do not know why consciousness exists, nor where it goes when the body falls silent. Every night, each of us crosses that threshold. We fall into sleep, and our waking world dissolves. Hours later, we return, carrying fragments of another dimension. Dreams. Jung called dreams the royal road to the unconscious, echoing Freud. But he went further. Dreams, he said, are the direct expression of the unconscious. They do not lie. To him, dreams were not random brain noise. They were letters from the soul written in the language of symbols. He observed that the psyche never wastes an image. Every animal, house, or river that appears is a message about the state of our inner world. Science calls it memory consolidation, the brain sorting through data. Jung called it conversation the self, trying to speak to the ego through metaphor. And then there are those dreams that seem to step outside of time. Patients would tell Jung that they dreamt of a death, a reunion, a disaster, only to see it unfold days later. He did not claim supernatural powers. He called it synchronicity, meaningful coincidence. It is as if, he wrote, the psyche and matter were two sides of one and the same coin, revealing the same truth in different languages. To Jung, these moments were glimpses of a pattern, the soul expressing itself simultaneously in the outer and inner worlds. Today, science continues to stumble upon these borderlands. In studies of near-death experiences, people whose hearts had stopped for minutes described vivid journeys, encounters with light, or meetings with deceased loved ones. Some accurately recalled details from operating rooms while their brains showed no measurable activity. The neuroscientist may call it an oxygen-deprived hallucination, but the experience feels no less real to those who return. One man told researchers, "I didn't see a light, I became it." Jung himself once crossed that boundary. In 1944, after suffering a heart attack, he reported floating far above the earth, seeing it bathed in blue light. He felt immense peace, as though every chain had fallen away. When he awoke, he wrote, "It is as though I had been reborn into the mystery of life itself." For the rest of his years, he no longer spoke of death as an end, but as a transformation, an expansion of consciousness beyond the limits of the ego. What is remarkable is how such experiences repeat across culture, religion, and era. Ancient Egyptians described the Ka, the life force that leaves the body but retains individuality. In Tibetan Buddhism, the Bardo state mirrors the same imagery of passage and review. Modern psychiatry may call them projections of the dying brain, but the universality of the symbols light, tunnel, reunion, peace suggests something archetypal, something rooted in the collective psyche. Jung would not have claimed proof of immortality. He distrusted dogma, whether religious or scientific. "I do not believe," he said. "I know that the psyche exists, for I have experienced it." To him, the soul was not a theory but an observation, the undeniable fact that the inner world behaves as though it were alive, purposeful, and intelligent. He once remarked that the soul appears to have a preference for wholeness over comfort. It moves us through pain and through wonder to make us remember who we are. Modern science faces a dilemma. Every time it pushes against the frontier of mind, it discovers data that looks suspiciously like myth. The cosmos begins to resemble a dream. Particles behave as if aware of being observed. The more deeply we measure the physical world, the more consciousness seems to hide behind it, quietly shaping it. Perhaps, as Jung suggested, psyche and matter are not separate realities, but complementary dimensions of the same unfolding mystery. And this brings us to an important turning point. If dreams, synchronicities, and near-death visions are not random, if they reveal an inner order beneath the chaos, then maybe the soul is not something added to life, but the very pattern by which life organizes itself. To understand that pattern, Jung gave us a map, the process by which the soul unfolds, matures, and integrates all its fragments. It is the story every human being lives, whether they know it or not, the story of the self seeking wholeness. If the soul exists, then it must have structure, not a physical one, but a psychological architecture that reveals how consciousness unfolds. Carl Jung dedicated his entire life to charting that inner terrain. What he discovered was not a system of belief, but a living process he called individuation, the journey of becoming whole. He often compared this process to alchemy. The alchemists believed that base metals could be transformed into gold, not merely through fire, but through the purification of the spirit of the one performing the work. Jung saw the same principle within the psyche. The raw material of human nature, fears, instincts, wounds, contradictions, could, through awareness, be transmuted into wisdom. The gold is not in the substance, he said. It is in the process. To understand how the soul transforms, Jung mapped 4 primary dimensions of the psyche. The first is the ego, the conscious I, the center of identity. It is the daylight self that says, I am this, not that. The ego is necessary. It organizes reality, makes choices, builds a life. But like a king who mistakes his crown for his kingdom, it tends to forget that it rules only a small province of the mind. Beneath it lies the vast territory of the unconscious. The second layer is the shadow, the repository of everything the ego rejects. Every anger you repress, every fear you deny, every impulse you label as unacceptable sinks into the shadow. Jung said, everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. But the shadow is not evil. It is simply unlived life. Within it lie our disowned talents, instincts, and truths. To integrate the shadow is to reclaim the fullness of being human. This is why Jung urged, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The third dimension is the anima and animus, the inner feminine in men and the inner masculine in women. Jung saw these as bridges between consciousness and the unconscious. The anima brings sensitivity, intuition, the capacity for relationship. The animus brings logic, structure, and strength. Both dwell within every psyche, regardless of gender. When denied, they distort into projections we chase or hate in others, what we have not accepted in ourselves. Jung wrote, the meeting of 2 personalities is like the contact of 2 chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. That transformation begins within, and at the heart of it all lies the self, the central archetype, the organizing principle of the entire psyche. It is not the ego made perfect. It is the totality that contains both the light and the shadow, the conscious and the unconscious. The self is the image of wholeness that appears in dreams as a circle, a mandala, or a radiant figure of guidance. Jung described it as the God within, though not in a theological sense, rather, as the deepest pattern of unity that our lives are unconsciously seeking to realize. The journey of individuation is the path by which the ego learns to bow before the self. It begins with confrontation, meeting the shadow, facing one's own contradictions. Then comes reconciliation, the inner marriage of opposites, where the masculine and feminine, the thinking and feeling, the doing and being, begin to balance. Finally, integration. The realization that everything we once fled from is part of the whole we were meant to become. Until you make the unconscious conscious, Jung warned, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Individuation is the process of turning fate into freedom. Throughout history, this pattern has appeared in mythic form: the hero's descent into the underworld, the shaman's dismemberment and rebirth, the alchemist's transformation of lead into gold. Jung recognized these not as stories of gods and heroes, but as mirrors of the inner journey every human being must eventually take. The underworld is the unconscious. The dragon is the shadow. The treasure is the self. Each myth whispers the same message: that wholeness requires descent before ascent, death before renewal. In modern terms, Individuation is not an escape from life, but a deepening into it. It does not promise perfection. It invites authenticity. Jung wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. And yet, only through that acceptance does the soul begin to breathe freely. When the ego loosens its grip, life begins to organize itself around a deeper intelligence. Synchronicities increase, dreams become vivid, relationships shift. The individual begins to feel guided, not by external rules, but by an inner compass aligned with truth. Science might call this intuition or pattern recognition, but Jung saw it as evidence that the psyche is self-regulating, that the unconscious continually strives toward balance. Just as the body heals a wound without our instruction, the psyche, too, seeks healing through the symbolic language of the soul. Every dream, every coincidence, every emotional crisis is a form of communication. The soul does not shout. It responds. It invites us to participate consciously in our own evolution. And so, the map Jung gave us is not just a theory, it is a guide for living. It teaches that within every conflict lies a potential for transformation. Within every darkness, a hidden seed of light. The self, that silent center of the soul, waits not at the end of the journey, but at every moment when we choose truth over comfort. Individuation, then, is not a goal. It is the continuous unfolding of the soul in time. But if Jung gave us the map, modern science has begun, perhaps unknowingly, to trace its outlines from another direction. Neuroscientists studying mystical experience, researchers analyzing the effects of meditation, even physicists exploring consciousness itself, all seem to circle the same realization, that what we call soul might be an emergent intelligence, an organizing field that includes both matter and mind. To see how these worlds begin to converge, we must look at the frontier where psychology and science meet the new evidence that hints that Jung may have been far ahead of his time. In recent decades, as if catching up to Jung's century-old intuition, science has begun to rediscover the territory he called the soul. It doesn't use the same word, of course. It speaks instead of altered states of consciousness, ego dissolution, or peak experiences. But when neuroscientists describe what happens during these states, when the boundaries of the self soften and a sense of unity floods the mind, they are unknowingly describing what Jung meant by contact with the self, the organizing principle of the psyche. Researchers studying meditation, prayer, and psychedelics now use the language of measurable transformation. Diminished activity in the brain's default mode network, changes in connectivity that correspond to feelings of unity and transcendence. Subjects often report the same realization. I was no longer separate. I felt connected to everything. To the lab, this is a change in neural patterns. To Jung, it was the soul remembering its origin, the individual consciousness merging again with the universal. Jung once wrote, "The experience of the self is always a defeat for the ego." In other words, the moment we encounter a greater consciousness, the smaller self must surrender its illusion of control. The psychedelic research of today, which documents ego death and the subsequent rebirth of meaning, mirrors this perfectly. Participants emerge from such sessions with a renewed sense of purpose, forgiveness, and peace. They speak of facing their shadow, of being embraced by light, of realizing that life itself is intelligent. Jung would have recognized these as classic signs of individuation, the soul integrating what was once divided. The convergence continues in the study of synchronicity. Though many scientists avoid the term, statistical anomalies and subjective coincidences have begun to attract serious inquiry in the fields of complexity theory and quantum mechanics. Jung defined synchronicity as a causal connecting principle, where inner and outer events mirror one another through meaning, not cause. Modern physics speaks of entanglement, where particles separated by vast distances behave as one. Jung, writing decades before quantum theory became mainstream, sensed that psyche and matter were not strangers but twins, two different aspects of one and the same reality, as he called them. Contemporary thinkers such as neuroscientist David Eagleman and physicist Donald Hoffman now suggest that what we perceive as reality may be a filtered interface, not the thing itself, a claim that echoes Jung's insight that we know nothing beyond the psyche. Even the concept of the collective unconscious finds new resonance in studies of genetic memory, archetypal storytelling patterns, and the shared neural responses to myth and music across cultures. The symbols that Jung said rise from the depths of the soul now appear to have biological fingerprints. In the meeting between science and spirituality, a strange humility is returning. The materialist certainty of the 20th century is giving way to a new question, not if consciousness exists, but what consciousness truly is. The more precisely we measure, the less solid the ground becomes. We find that matter behaves like mind, and mind behaves like matter. The boundaries blur. Jung anticipated this. Every advance in knowledge, he said, brings us closer to the mystery of things, not farther from it. The science of mystical experience has therefore become not a contradiction of psychology, but its continuation. It validates what Jung observed in dreams and symbols, that human beings are wired for transcendence. When the ego loosens, when the rational mind pauses, the psyche reveals an intelligence that is both personal and cosmic. What the mystic called union with God, Jung called the realization of the self. Both point to the same transformation, a moment when the division between observer and observed collapses, and life is felt as one continuous presence. And so, perhaps the old debate between science and soul is ending not in victory for one side, but in reconciliation. Each is learning the language of the other. The microscope is beginning to glimpse what the myth has always sung. The soul, it seems, was never against science. It was what made science possible. For only a conscious universe can ask to know itself. But for all this evidence and convergence, one question still remains. Why does any of this matter? Beyond research papers and philosophical arguments, why does the idea of a soul speak so powerfully to us? Jung would answer that it is because the soul is not a theory we study, it is the very condition of being alive. And when it is ignored, life loses meaning. To understand why this question is more than intellectual curiosity, why it touches the very core of our existence, we must turn to the next part of our journey, the existential meaning of the soul. We have traveled from biology to psychology, from the measurable to the mysterious. But now, we return to where all great questions end: the human heart. For the question, is the soul real, is not merely a philosophical puzzle. It is a cry that rises when the outer world can no longer answer our inner emptiness. Jung understood this better than anyone. In his letters, he often wrote that the greatest suffering of modern humanity was not material poverty, but spiritual starvation. People grow neurotic, he said, because they cannot find meaning in their lives. The loss of meaning, he believed, is not a side effect of progress. It is the inevitable shadow of a world that worships the measurable and neglects the invisible. When life becomes only a sequence of tasks, the soul retreats. And what we call anxiety, burnout, or depression is often its faint knocking at the door. He observed this in his patients. People who had achieved what society promised would make them hold status, family, security, and yet felt hollow. They came to him not because they were weak, but because their souls refused to remain silent. Jung wrote, "In the final analysis, we count for something only because of the essential we embody. And if we do not embody that, life is wasted. The soul demands embodiment. It wants to live through you, not as an idea, but as a felt presence. In this way, the question of the soul is not about belief but orientation. When you know that you have a soul or that you are one, your relationship with life changes. The small dramas lose their tyranny. Pain no longer feels meaningless. It becomes part of a larger process." Jung called this the teleology of the soul, the idea that our experiences, especially our suffering, serve a deeper purpose, leading us toward integration. There is no coming to consciousness, he said, without pain. Even neuroscience has begun to mirror this insight. Studies on post-traumatic growth show that crises can transform identity, expand empathy, and awaken spirituality. Jung would have smiled at this data not as proof, but as recognition. He often said that the psyche moves with a purpose beyond our comprehension. The ego wants stability. The soul wants evolution. When we resist, life invents the situations that force us to change. But why is meaning so essential? Because the human psyche cannot live in a vacuum of significance. When we lose connection to something greater than ourselves, whether we call it soul, self, or purpose, we begin to drift. We mistake motion for direction, productivity for fulfillment. Jung warned that the modern person, having replaced faith with intellect, stands at the edge of a great void. The only way forward is inward. He once told a patient, "Your task is not to seek for happiness, but to seek what your soul demands of you." That demand may not be comfortable. It may call you to leave a career, end a relationship, or confront long-buried grief. Yet behind the discomfort lies vitality. The soul does not care for convenience. It cares for authenticity. And when authenticity returns, even suffering acquires meaning. This is why the question of the soul matters. Because when we deny it, we live only half a life, functional but fragmented. But when we listen, something extraordinary happens. The same world begins to shine again. Ordinary moments regain their weight. Silence becomes rich. Relationships deepen. The soul does not add something new to life, it restores what was always there. And that, Jung believed, is the purpose of psychology itself. Not to make life easier, but to make it meaningful. Only the truth of a life lived, he said, can heal the soul. The path of individuation is not an escape from the world, but a reconciliation with it. A realization that the outer and inner worlds are two mirrors reflecting one flame. And as we approach the end of this journey, a final question emerges. If the soul gives meaning to life, what gives meaning to the soul? For Jung, the answer lay in integration, the union of opposites, the acceptance of both light and shadow. In our final section, we will see how that union brings peace not through belief, but through presence. We began with a question, is the soul real? And we end not with an answer, but with a realization. The soul, perhaps, was never something to be proven. It was the very capacity in us that asks the question in the first place. Jung once said, "The psyche is not of this world, yet it is the condition of our experience of the world." He meant that the soul is not an object among objects. It is the bridge between the inner and outer realms, between the measurable and the meaningful. Science can analyze the structure of a thought, but it cannot measure the love behind it. Religion can speak of the divine, but it cannot replace the personal work of becoming whole. The soul stands between, not as a wall, but as a meeting place. Throughout this journey, we have seen two visions of reality. The neuroscientist sees the brain generating consciousness, a miracle of biology. Jung sees consciousness as the universe awakening to itself through us, a miracle of being. Both are true within their own frames, and yet, something greater holds them together. The soul is that greater context, the quiet intelligence that uses both matter and meaning to reveal itself. If science gives us knowledge, the soul gives us wisdom. Knowledge tells us how life works. Wisdom tells us why it matters. Knowledge builds machines. The soul builds character. When they are separated, we progress technologically, but regress spiritually. Jung warned of this imbalance in the early 20th century, saying, "The gods have become diseases. The gods we no longer recognize now live in our symptoms." What he meant was that when the soul's voice is silenced, its energy turns inward, manifesting as anxiety, addiction, or despair. The cure is not suppression but dialogue to meet the divine within ourselves once more. This dialogue is not abstract. It happens each time you turn toward your own truth instead of away from it. Each time you listen to a dream, honor an intuition, forgive a shadow, or love without control, you are living the soul's language. You are walking the bridge. Jung believed that if enough individuals lived this way, culture itself would heal. He wrote, "The salvation of the world depends on the salvation of the individual soul." So perhaps the real question is not whether the soul exists, but whether we are willing to live as though it does. Because when we do, something shifts, fear loses its authority, time slows down, and life regains depth. the ordinary becomes sacred again, and the same world that once felt fragmented begins to reveal its hidden coherence. Maybe that is the secret Jung left us, that the soul is not an article of faith, but an experience, the most direct experience of being alive. It cannot be defined because it is what defines us. It cannot be found because it is the one who is searching. In the end, we do not need to choose between science and spirit, between neuron and symbol, between logic and mystery. We need only to see that both are expressions of one reality trying to know itself. As Jung wrote near the end of his life, "In all chaos there is a cosmos. In all disorder, a secret order." And perhaps that secret order is what we have always called the soul. Not a ghost within the body, but the living pattern of meaning that connects everything. Not an object to prove, but a truth to remember. The soul is the bridge, the road that leads home,